I have worked in motorsport engineering for 19 years. I have stood in pit lanes at 3 different racing series, crouched beside engines that cost more than most people earn in a decade, and watched some of the most technically accomplished mechanics in the country do their jobs with a precision that looked almost like prayer. I have seen a lot of things in that time that I could not fully explain. What happened in the Harlow Performance Fabrication Bay on a Thursday in October was the thing I explain the least often and think about the most. I should start where it started. Or, more honestly, I should start where I first understood that something was wrong. Not with the engine, not yet, but with the room. The floor supervisor came to get me at 7 minutes past 9 in the morning. His name was Derek Suggs, and he was a man whose confidence in his own judgment had never been meaningfully tested until that day, which is the most dangerous kind of confidence there is. He walked me toward the glass-walled conference room at the far end of the engineering wing. Through the glass, I could see Claire Voss standing at the head of the table. She was 38 years old, the chief executive of Harlow Performance Dynamics, and she had the look of someone who had already made its decision and was now in the less interesting work of executing it. There was one other person in the room. He was seated, not standing, in a chair that had been pulled slightly away from the table, as if he had wanted to signal, even in this moment, that he was not quite part of whatever was happening. His name was Thomas Reyes. He was 43 years old, and he had been working in the Harlow Fabrication Bay for 7 months, since joining as a contract engineer in March. He wore a gray work shirt with the Harlow logo on the left chest. His boots were steel-toed and old, and had been re-soled at least once that I could tell. His hands were resting in his lap and they were completely still. And that stillness, the specific quality of it, the kind that is not the absence of motion but a decision about it, was the first thing I had noticed about Thomas Reyes the day he arrived, and it was the thing I was looking at now. Claire was speaking. Thomas had not raised his head. I do not know everything that was said before I arrived. Derek had not been subtle about wanting me there to observe, and the door was partially open. I heard the end of it. I heard Claire say that the decision had been made at the level above the engineering division. I heard her say that it was a matter of clearance compliance, that a documentation audit had flagged an anomaly in Thomas's project access history. I heard her say that someone from HR would process his exit paperwork by noon. Thomas looked up then. Not at Claire. He looked at the whiteboard on the far wall, where 3 of his own schematic revisions were still mounted in a row from the previous week's design review. He said one thing. The secondary ring mount on Unit 7 is not finished. Claire said that the team would handle it. Thomas said, no one on the team knows the specification. Claire said that was a matter for the engineering leads to manage. Thomas looked at her for a moment. His face did not move. There was nothing theatrical about what he did next. He stood up. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket, which is something I had seen him do before. A small, habitual gesture that seemed to mean something to him, though I had never asked what. He placed a folded piece of paper on the conference table, his lanyard and access badge on top of it. And then he walked to the door and he said, not to Claire, not to Derek, but to the room itself, which is a thing very few people know how to do. He said, Unit 7 is not a documentation problem. Then he was gone. That was the beginning. What I did not know then, what I would not understand until 4 days later, when I was standing in the fabrication bay watching 3 senior engineers and a specialist flown in from Charlotte try to diagnose a fault that was destroying the prototype's secondary compression cycle, was that Thomas Reyes had not come to Harlow Performance Dynamics by accident, and what he had been doing there, quietly and without announcement, for the past 7 months had nothing to do with the access of anomaly Derek Suggs had flagged. It had to do with the engine, and with the man who built it. This is the part I go back to most. That same Thursday morning before the floor supervisor found me, before anything had happened yet, Thomas Reyes had arrived at the fabrication bay at 6:43, the way he always arrived, before the shift change, before the overhead lights in the main hall had fully warmed up. I had there myself, running a check on a testing rig in the adjacent bay, and I could see him through the connecting window without him seeing me. He had a daughter. Her name was Margot, and she was 7 years old, and she came with him to the bay every Thursday morning because her school did not start until 9, and the woman who usually watched her on those mornings had moved to Tucson in the spring. She sat on a folding stool near the side workbench, with a hardback sketchbook open on her knees, drawing things. She always brought the sketchbook. She had been bringing it since March, when Thomas first arrived, and I had seen the inside of it once, when she held it up to show me something. Every drawing was a machine. Not cars exactly, the insides of things, gears and shafts and cross-sections of things that ran. She drew them the way children draw houses, from memory, without reference, without questioning whether she was allowed. She also carried a small brass gear. Not a working gear from any machine I recognized. A smooth-edged, palm-sized piece of polished brass, with a ribbon threaded through the center hole, the kind of ribbon that had been handled so many times it had lost its original color and settled into something between gold and gray. Her father had told her to keep it in her coat pocket. And she did, except when she was drawing, when it sat on the edge of the workbench in front of her like a paperweight. I heard her tell another mechanic once that her mother had given it to her before Margot was old enough to remember it happening. She said it like she was stating a fact about weather. Completely matter-of-fact, completely composed. She was her father's daughter in that way. That Thursday morning, Thomas had been working on the Unit 7 assembly for 47 minutes. When Margot looked up from her sketchbook and said, without particular alarm, "Dad, your hands are doing the thing." He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "Which thing?" She said, "The slow thing. When you're thinking about something that's not right yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's almost right." She went back to her drawing. She had a patience about her that made most adults in the room feel, mildly, like they were operating below the required level. Thomas spent 9 more minutes on Unit 7. He made 2 small adjustments to the secondary ring mount, adjustments I could not see clearly from my position, and that were not in any revision log I was able to pull afterward, because they were never logged. That was not negligence. That was Thomas. He documented what he considered complete. He did not consider Unit 7 complete. He never got the chance to finish it. At 9:27 that morning, he was escorted from the building with the folded paper still sitting on the conference table and 3 schematics still mounted on the whiteboard. Margot had her coat on and her sketchbook under her arm and the brass gear. She called it Wren. I learned later, because her mother had given it to her on a Wednesday, and Margot had decided that Wednesday names should start with W, tucked into her right coat pocket. She held her father's hand as they walked across the parking lot. She did not look back at the building. I did. The name of the man I should tell you about next is Preston Holt. He was the chief operating officer of Harlow Performance Dynamics, and he had been in that position for 4 years, which is long enough to understand exactly how a company works, and long enough to have learned which pieces of it to lean on and which to quietly avoid. He was 51 years old, with the particular groomed certainty of a person who had never been in a room where he was the least experienced person present. He sat on the same board subcommittee that controlled the documentation audit process. He had also, I would later learn, submitted the flag that initiated the access anomaly review the previous week. He had not done this because Thomas Reyes had violated any access protocol. He had done it because Thomas Reyes was almost finished with Unit 7, and a finished Unit 7 would tell a story that Preston Holt had spent 3 years making sure no one at Harlow Performance Dynamics would ever be able to read. I did not know this on Thursday. I knew it by Sunday, but I am getting ahead of myself. The failure came on Saturday. The test team brought Unit 7 online at 7 in the morning with the secondary ring mount, still configured to Thomas's last logged revision, which was not the final revision. The distinction was invisible in the documentation. Nobody on the test team knew there was a distinction. The engine ran cleanly for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Then the secondary compression cycle developed a fault signal in the monitoring system. A reading that should not have been possible under the logged configuration, because, under the logged configuration, the thermal balance at that junction should have been stable. It was not stable. Within 20 minutes, the fault signal had cascaded into the primary compression cycle. The engine shut itself down automatically, which was the right outcome, and the only reason a very expensive prototype was not destroyed in the next 3 minutes. I was not in the bay when it happened. I arrived at 8:43 after Derek had called me. The test team was standing around the engine in a kind of professional shock, not panic, because these were experienced engineers and panic was not in their vocabulary, but something close to its technical equivalent, which is the silence that comes when something has gone wrong in a way that should not have been possible. I looked at the engine. I looked at the monitoring data. I looked at the secondary ring mount configuration. I knew what I was looking at, which is to say I could see the outline of it, the way you can see the outline of something through frosted glass. There was a piece missing. Not physically, analytically. There was a decision in the architecture that had not been made yet, and the engine had gone to the place where that unmade decision lived and reported back on its condition. Who completed the ring mount, I asked. No one answered. Who ran the final sign-off on Unit 7 before the test? Derek said that Thomas Reyes had been the assigned engineer on that assembly. He said it in the tone of someone filing a report rather than answering a question. I said, Thomas didn't sign off. He flagged it as incomplete. Derek said that the flag had been cleared by the system overnight. He said it had been marked closed. I looked at the monitoring data again. Then I looked at the whiteboard in the engineering wing, which I could see through the connecting window, where Thomas's 3 schematic revisions were still mounted exactly where he had left them. No one else was coming. That was when I understood that clearly. Claire Voss arrived in the bay at 9:15. She was wearing the same expression she had worn in the conference room 2 days earlier, except that now it was under more pressure and had developed a small fracture along the edge of it. The look of a person who has been managing outcomes and has just encountered one that declined to be managed. She stood at the edge of the monitoring station and looked at the data with the attention of someone trying to read a language they mostly knew, and I watched her work through it. And I watched her arrive at the same place I had arrived at, which was the conclusion that this particular language had a word in it that she had never been taught. She asked the senior engineer what the fault was. He told her what it appeared to be. She asked what the correction was. He told her they were working on it. She asked how long. He paused for exactly 4 seconds, which is a long pause for a man who is not given to pauses, and said that the issue traced back to an undocumented modification at the gunnery ring mount, and that without understanding the intent of modification, the team could not safely reconstruct the correct configuration. Claire was quiet. She asked who had been working on the secondary ring mount. The senior engineer said Thomas Reyes. The room had its own quality of silence after that. Not the silence of people who are not speaking, but the silence of people who are thinking the same thing and have agreed, without discussing it, not to say it first. I said it. I said we need to talk to Thomas. Derek started to say something about the access review and the HR paperwork. Claire looked at Derek in a way that ended that sentence before it reached its destination. Then she looked at me. The people in that room were not incompetent. I want to be precise about that. The senior engineer, Marcus Webb, had 17 years of motorsport fabrication experience and had worked on 3 championship-winning power units at 2 different teams. The specialist from Charlotte, a woman named Dr. Patricia Saul, held patents of her own in thermal management systems and had been flown in at significant expense because her reputation in exactly this category of fault was substantial. They were the right people for almost any version of this problem. They were the wrong people for this one, And they were the wrong people because the fault did not live in any documentation they had access to. It lived in a gap between what Thomas had planned and what the builders had executed, a gap so precise and so specific that you would need to have been inside both the original design intent and the current physical configuration simultaneously to recognize it. Marcus and Patricia had one of those two things. Thomas had both. Marcus had spent 3 hours on Sunday morning tracing the fault backward through the monitoring data, and each layer he peeled back led to the same junction and the same configuration. And he kept arriving at the conclusion that the configuration was correct, according to every document that existed, and yet the engine was clearly behaving as though it were wrong. He had said to me at one point, with the controlled frustration of a person who respects the rules of evidence too much to stop following them, even when they lead nowhere. It is as if the engine knows something the documentation doesn't. He was not wrong. That was exactly what was happening. I want to be careful about how I describe Claire Voss here, because I think the easy version of this story wants her to be the villain, and she was not the villain. She had been told a version of events by someone she trusted, and she had acted on that version, and she had acted on it in front of a room full of people, and now she was standing in that room's aftermath, trying to locate the moment where the version she had been given and the reality she was currently living had separated from each other. That is not villainy. That is what happens to people who trust the wrong person for the wrong reasons. She said to me quietly, "Do you know how to reach him?" I did not give her his number. I gave her the address of his daughter's school, because it was Saturday, and Thomas always spent Saturday mornings at the school. He ran a small mechanical workshop there on weekends, unofficial, unfunded, held in the maintenance shed behind the gymnasium, because the principal had seen what he was doing with the kids who attended and had decided that the liability of hosting it was less important than the thing itself. He had been doing it for 3 years. He had never mentioned it at Harlow. Not because he was hiding it, but because it was his. I said, "He'll be there until noon." This is the part I did not see with my own eyes, but I have heard it described by 2 people who were present, and both descriptions agreed on the things that mattered. Claire arrived at the school at 10:40 in the morning. She was alone. She had not called ahead. She walked around the side of the building to the maintenance shed, and she stopped in the doorway. Inside the shed, 7 children between the ages of 6 and 11 were seated around a low workbench. Each of them had a small disassembled mechanical component in front of them, a hinge, a gear set, a section of track mechanism, and Thomas was moving around the perimeter of the group, pausing at each child, saying something, moving on. Margot was at the end of the bench. She had her sketchbook open and the brass gear wren on the bench beside it, and she was explaining something to the child next to her, with the patient authority of someone who has been doing this longer than the other person. Thomas saw Claire in the doorway. He finished what he was saying to the child nearest him. Then he walked to the door and stepped outside. He looked at her. He did not say anything. Claire said, "I owe you an apology." Thomas said nothing. He waited. She said, "I looked at the paperwork and I made a decision, and I did not ask you a single question first. I should have. I knew better than that, and I didn't do it." She paused. "I'm sorry." A cement truck was moving somewhere on the street behind the school. Someone inside the shed had dropped something metal, and it rang against the concrete floor and then went quiet. Thomas said, "Who filed the access flag?" Claire said, "Preston Holt." Thomas looked at her steadily. "How long has he been redirecting the patent filings?" It was not a question, exactly. It landed in a space between a question and a statement of something already known. Claire's face did not change, but something behind it adjusted very slightly, the way a compass needle adjusts when it finds its direction. She said, "I don't know what you mean." Thomas said, "Yes, you do. You just didn't have a name for it until right now." The door of the shed opened. Margot appeared in the frame, holding her sketchbook. She looked at Claire with the straightforward attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking at someone. She said, "Are you from the place where my dad works?" Claire said. "Yes." Margot thought about this. Then she said, "He made something there. Something important. He always knows when something isn't finished yet." She went back inside. Claire stood in the doorway of the maintenance shed for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at Thomas and said, "I need to show you something. It's easier if you see it yourself." Thomas said he needed to finish the session. He said it would be done by noon. He said he would come after. Claire said she would wait in the parking lot. He came at 12:17. Margot was with him, because there was nowhere else for her to be, and he did not leave her to wait alone. Claire drove them both. Margot sat in the back seat with Wren in her lap and her sketchbook open and did not appear to require entertainment. What Claire showed Thomas when they returned to Harlow was a set of documents she had found that morning in the internal patent archive. Not in any system she had been given access to when she joined, but in a partition of the company's founding records that her predecessor had left unsealed, apparently by accident, or perhaps not by accident, because accidents like that tend to have reasons. The documents were original design specifications. They were dated 5 years earlier, which was 4 years before Harlow Performance Dynamics had publicly announced the engine architecture that was currently in their prototype. The designs were comprehensive, annotated, revised, internally consistent, and they were credited to a single engineer. The name on every page was Thomas Reyes. The patents that Harlow held on that same architecture, the patents that had been filed and registered in the company's name, the patents that formed the core of the company's IP portfolio, and the foundation of a capital raise worth $41 million, listed no individual inventor. Preston Holt had been the head of patent strategy when those filings were made. The specific documentation of what Holt had done over the 4 years since those filings, the legal structure he had built, the internal records he had modified, the external correspondence he had managed to ensure that no inquiry ever reached Thomas Reyes's name, had taken Claire the rest of Saturday afternoon to work through, and a full Sunday morning to fully understand. She had not slept that night. I know because she was in the building when I arrived at 6:30 Sunday morning, still at her desk with 4 inches of printed records on one side and a cold cup of coffee on the other. And her face had the specific settled quality of someone who has been very angry for a long time and has passed through the anger into something quieter and more determined. Thomas had come on Sunday, too. He had come at 8 in the morning without being asked, and he had gone directly to Unit 7. He did not ask for his access to be restored. He did not ask for anything. He just showed up and started working, and nobody stopped him, because it was increasingly apparent to everyone in the building that stopping him had been the error and letting him work was the correction. I watched him for a while from the connecting bay. His hands were moving with the unhurried precision I had noticed the first day he arrived, that quality I had tried to describe to people and never found quite the right words for, the quality of someone who is not in a hurry because they understand the material at the level where hurrying becomes irrelevant. Margot was on her stool with her sketchbook. Wren was on the workbench. At 10:47, Thomas made the final adjustment to the secondary ring mount. He did not announce it. He set down the tool he was using, stepped back from the unit, looked at it for 3 seconds, and then said, to me, because I happened to be the person nearest him, "It's done." I said, "How long have you known what it needed?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since March," he said. The architecture was right. The build sequence needed one correction. One. He picked up a cloth from the bench and cleaned his hands with it. 7 months is a long time to wait for correction. He had not been correcting the work of the engineers who built it. He had been correcting work he had done himself 5 years earlier in a specification that had been taken from him and built without his knowledge, built in one specific regard incorrectly because the people who built it from his plans had not understood what one annotation meant and had implemented it wrong, and the error had been propagating through every subsequent revision for 5 years. Invisible because no one knew what to compare it against. He had come to Harlow as a contract engineer because it was the only way to get close enough to the machine to fix it. He had not told anyone this, not because he was concealing it, but because the machine was the point. Not the credit, not the argument, the machine. The Unit 7 test ran on Tuesday of the following week. The compression cycle ran for 43 minutes without a fault signal. The thermal balance at the secondary junction was exactly what Thomas's original specification had described it should be. The senior engineer who had been working the problem for 3 days stood at the monitoring station and looked at the data for a long time without saying anything. And then he said quietly, "To no one in particular." That's what it was supposed to do the whole time. Preston Holt was in the building on Monday morning when the legal team arrived. He had been in the building every morning because until the prior week he had had no reason to believe anything was coming, and the thing about a cover-up built on the confidence that no one will ever look is that when someone looks, you do not have time to run. He was called into Claire's office at 9 and the door closed, and 2 members of the legal team went in with him and came out 40 minutes later without him. He came out 11 minutes after that, alone, with his jacket over one arm and his expression arranged into the professional composure of a man who was performing the last act of performance available to him. He stopped at the doorway to the outer hall. He said, "This will not hold in court." Nobody said anything. The door closed behind him. Security was at the elevator. The story moved on. Thomas's name was entered into the patent record on Wednesday. Not announced, not celebrated, simply corrected, with a formal amendment filed through the company's Intellectual Property Council and recorded with the relevant office. His name, his dates, his original specification. The record updated to reflect what had actually happened. It took approximately 1 paragraph of legal language to do it. That was enough. What happened after that was quieter than people might expect. Thomas went back to his contract. He did not ask for a different title. He did not ask for a larger office. He did ask in writing for one condition before he would remain, that the weekend workshop at the school be funded by Harlow, staffed by volunteer engineers from the company, and made available to any child in the district who wanted to come, not just the 7 who had been coming informally. He asked for this on behalf of the children in the shed. He did not ask for anything on his own behalf. Claire accepted without modification. I think about the version of that Thursday morning I could not see when I was standing in it. I think about what Thomas knew and what he carried and what he did and did not say. I think about Unit 7 and the 7 months and the one erection. I think about a man who could have argued, who could have produced documents, who could have made a scene in a glass-walled conference room with 3 of his own schematics still mounted on the whiteboard behind him, and who instead buttoned the middle button of his jacket and set down his badge and said one true sentence to a room that was not yet ready to understand it. He knew what the engine needed. He also, I have come to believe, knew what the situation needed, which was for him to leave the building quietly so that the machine would eventually force the question on its own, in a language that could not be argued with, or managed or flagged for review. The machine was always going to ask for him. He waited until it did. I ran into him 2 weeks later on a Friday afternoon. He was in the parking lot after the shift end, loading a flat crate of equipment into the back of his truck. A 2004 Dodge Ram with a cracked corner of the rear bumper and a repair to the tailgate that had been done with a different colored steel. He was working quickly with the economy of motion I had come to recognize as his baseline. Margot was sitting on the tailgate eating crackers from a small bag, her sketchbook on her knee, Wren visible in her coat pocket. I told him I was glad he came back. He said he had not left exactly. He said he had just gone to a different work. Margot looked up from her sketchbook. She said, "Dad says the machine always knows." I said, "Knows what?" She said, "If someone fixed it right." Thomas closed the tailgate. He looked at he looked at his daughter for a moment in the way I had said at her before. Not with the particular display of parental affection that people perform when someone is watching, but with the simple private attention of a man who is checking that the most important thing in the room is all right. She was eating her crackers. She was all right. He said goodnight and got in the truck, and Margot got in on the other side with the sketchbook still open, and the truck pulled out of the lot with a small sound from the exhaust and turned onto the main road and moved into the ordinary traffic of a Friday afternoon, as if nothing had happened, as if the week had been a regular week, as if an engine had not confirmed what a whole institution had refused to acknowledge for 5 years. I stood in the parking lot for a moment after they were gone. I have thought about what Thomas said, the part about not leaving, about going to a different part of the work. I have thought about it more than most things I heard that week, which had no shortage of things worth thinking about. There are people in this world who know their work completely, who have built something with enough precision and care, that even when it is taken from them, even when their name is removed from it, and the record is adjusted and the institution moves on without them, the work itself remembers. It carries the signature of their attention in the way that anything made with real knowledge carries it. In the tolerances, in the choices that look like accidents to people who do not understand them, in the one correction that only one person knows how to make. You cannot remove a person's knowledge by removing their name. You cannot discredit a design by reassigning its patent. You cannot fix what a man built without his hands by describing his absence in professional language and calling it a documentation issue. The engine knew this. It was always going to find a way to say so. There was a morning about 3 weeks after everything, on a regular Thursday, when I arrived early again and saw Thomas through the connecting window. He was at the workbench. Margot was on her stool with her sketchbook. Wren was on the workbench beside the sketchbook, facing the engine. The overhead lights had just finished warming up. The bay smelled of metal and coolant, and the particular clean smell of a machine that is doing exactly what it was built to do. Margot was drawing. She had her head bent low over the page, her pencil moving with the focused efficiency of someone who does not need to think about the act itself, only the subject. I could not see what she was drawing. I did not need to. Outside, the morning was conducting its ordinary business. A delivery truck backed into the loading dock. The freight elevator at the east end of the building completed its cycle and stopped. Somewhere above us, 3 floors up, the management offices were beginning to fill with the particular human noise of a company at work. Phones, footsteps, the muffled passage of a conversation through a shared wall. And in the bay, Thomas Reyes checked the tension on a new assembly with the same unhurried hands he had always used, and his daughter turned a page, and the engine held its configuration, and the morning had nowhere else to be. This is a work of fiction. All names, characters, companies, institutions, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events or organizations is purely coincidental. This story was created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. Every week, we tell the stories of the people the world walked past too quickly. They were worth stopping for.